APAC.
Today we've got a very special forum as part of the series of debates and discussions we're running, and this one focuses on the not-for-profit sector and the policies of the parties as they affect that sector. It's a growing part of our economy as well as our society, and I was interested to learn in doing a little bit of research for this that the sector now employs something like 8% of Australia's workforce, so close to 1 million Australians. So it's a reasonably large proportion of our economy, as well as a sector that provides many of the vital social services that many of us rely on, whether it's childcare or aged care, many of the things that keep our society functioning. Today we are delighted to have with us Kevin Andrews, the Shadow Minister for Families, Housing and Human Services, Doug Cameron, here in his capacity as the Parliamentary Secretary for Housing and Homelessness, and Rachel Siewert, the Greens spokesperson on families, communities, disabilities, aged care and many other hats. And we also want to say a particular thank you as well to the Communities Council of Australia for their assistance in pulling today's event together and organising it with us. I'm Misha Siewert and I'll be your moderator for today. I'm a director of the National Press Club, but like so many Australians, I've also had a lifetime of involvement in not-for-profits myself in many capacities. So our rules for today are simple. There'll be 7-minute addresses from each of our participants at the outset, and then a chance for some questions and responses to each other's answers, and then a 1-minute summation in reverse order at the beginning. And by mutual consent, see, agreement is possible in politics, Kevin Andrews has agreed to be our first speaker, and we ask you to welcome him warmly. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Misha, ladies and gentlemen. We in Australia are a proud nation, a country built on working hard, helping our mates, supporting our neighbours and strengthening our communities. Charities and not-for-profits are at the very core of Australian society. Today, I would like to set out the Coalition's vision for this critical sector. There are some 600,000 charitable and voluntary organisations in Australia, the vast majority of which are small, unincorporated bodies, and less than 10% are deemed to be economically significant by the ABS. They are the local carers groups in the towns and the cities across Australia. They're the sporting clubs, the congregations, the communities that fund and build schools, the welfare agencies, the bands of people who come together to support medical research or assist the poor and the afflicted, both here and overseas. They're the myriad of large and small associations that provide the vital organic being of our nation. Ladies and gentlemen, the institutions of civil society are important because they are neither created nor controlled by the state. Public funding requires accountability, and services require training and skills and a professional approach. But it's important that the independence and the volunteering ethos of the sector is protected and encouraged. The Coalition will guard against unnecessary state control of civil society, and unlike Labor, will not seek to seduce community groups into becoming mouthpieces of government. The Coalition prefers the term civil society. The description not-for-profit immediately connotes an economic framework, whereas civil society conveys a broader, different notion of which the economic is just one part. Ladies and gentlemen, over a year ago we announced our approach to civil society based on recognising and supporting the work of the institutions in this sector, an approach based on cutting and reducing red tape, of providing greater flexibility for the sector. It's an approach that trusts the institutions of civil society to govern their own affairs without constant government oversight. Ladies and gentlemen, philanthropic contributions have tapered off in recent years. If elected, the Coalition will seek to encourage a culture of giving in Australia through re-establishing the Community Business Partnership. Philanthropic endeavours strengthen and empower communities, harness the inherent virtue of Australians and encourage a greater sense of purpose and belonging across communities and income groups. Our volunteer services, welfare, environmental, sporting and community groups are all living testimony to the Coalition's belief in empowered communities. We believe that a community that freely gives of its time and financial resources is a community with a stronger social fabric and more social capital. We don't want government to do less for people, but we certainly want people to have the capacity to do more for themselves, because that's the way that stronger communities are built. A coalition government would therefore, within 6 months, re-establish the Community Business Partnership to advise government on encouraging a culture of giving in this country. The partnership will encourage prominent Australians from the business and community sector to work together for the benefit of the community, and it will be chaired by the Prime Minister. Ladies and gentlemen, our approach is about practical measures to cut red tape and reduce the regulatory burden facing civil society. Let me take the example of family and community service agencies. For these agencies, the coalition government would implement one contract with each agency instead of multiple contracts, require the department to negotiate genuinely the content of that contract, simplify the auditing process, replace the system of rolling audits with one initial benchmarking audit for a period of 5 years, simplifying reporting requirements for governance arrangements, require agencies to simply report with an annual governance return, replace the current time-consuming and costly data collection system with a series of cross-sector evaluations of programs, and work with the sector to ensure that adequate and known whistleblower provisions are in place. These measures would significantly reduce the reporting requirements on the sector, and the savings could then be used by agencies across this country in frontline services. Ladies and gentlemen, the establishment of the Australian Charities and Not-for-Profits Commission was proposed with the object to protect and enhance public trust and confidence for the not-for-profit sector by establishing a national regulatory framework. Nowhere has the mischief that requires this new monolithic regulatory structure, or that justifies the sweeping powers of the ACNC, been identified. In keeping with our commitment to reduce red tape on the not-for-profit sector, a coalition government will abolish the ACNC and replace it with a centre for excellence, one that will have its ownership transferred to the sector itself. The focus on the new centre will shift from endless compliance and regulation to a body that encourages innovation, education and best practice, and will be also able to advise the government and undertake research. Ladies and gentlemen, for far too long government has treated civil society with platitudes, with rhetoric. And over the last few years, Labor has pursued a new way. More regulation, more duplication, more compliance. It may be why not one of their 30-odd ministers is here today. There is a better way. We believe in working with the sector, not directing the sector and treating it as an extension of the state. And we believe that those working in the sector are best placed to tell us how we can work together to ensure that we are making life easier for civil society, not harder. Our practical approach is not about making the sector feel good. It's about empowering the sector to be as good as it can. Ladies and gentlemen, the political community should be of service to civil society. And if we're elected in September, we will ensure that we are. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Can I now invite Senator Cameron to give his opening address as well? I should say, please make him warmly welcome as well.
Well, thank you, Misha. Could I acknowledge the traditional owners of the land and pay my respects to their elders, past and present. I'd like to thank the Community Council for Australia for organising today's events, and I would also like to thank the National Press Club for being our hosts today. Labor believes in a fairer and more inclusive Australia. We believe in a better society. It's a philosophy that informs every policy decision we make. And it's a philosophy that has informed our approach to the not-for-profit sector. We have been working in partnership with you to deliver important reforms to strengthen and support the sector. And together with the not-for-profit sector, we've built some significant foundations to ensure that the sector has the opportunity to grow and thrive. Together, we have established the Australian Charities and Not-for-Profits Commission, Australia's first independent and dedicated charities regulator, international best practice in terms of regulation and support for the sector. We have introduced a statutory definition of charity to provide more certainty and clarity to the definition. We're now not based back in UK 1600s law. We've got a modern definition. Now, the Coalition proposes to abolish the ACNC and go back to having the ATO as the de facto regulator of charities. They clearly aren't listening to you, because that's not the position that the industry wants. We've passed new legislation which bans gag clauses in Commonwealth contracts with the not-for-profit sector. The Howard government, in which Mr Andrews was a senior minister, used gag clauses to silence and intimidate the not-for-profit sector. Labour governments respect the independence of the sector, and we value your role in public debates. As I've just said before, Labour believes in a fairer and more inclusive Australia. We've created 950,000 jobs since we came to office. We've invested in innovation, infrastructure, health. We've created Disability Cares Australia, the Better Schools Plan. We've invested in important community services. Contrast that with the record of the Coalition when they were last in government. They neglected our nation's infrastructure. They ripped $1 billion from health. They gave us work choices which attacked basic entitlements for working Australians. The Coalition ensured that equal pay for social and community services workers was a pipe dream. And they didn't want to be criticised, and that's why they gagged the sector. By their own admission, the Coalition currently has a $70 billion black hole. Sol Eslake thinks it's $30 billion. Whatever the exact number is, it's a huge hole. They've already announced $17 billion in savage cuts to family payments, superannuation and jobs. But they're hiding the rest of their cuts. What does that mean for the Australian community? It means austerity, it means cost-cutting, and it means cost-shifting. It means that everything that is old is suddenly new again. What Mr Andrews and the Coalition are proposing is a rebadging of the failed big society experiment in the United Kingdom. That's not surprising, because we know one of the fathers of the big society failure has been to Australia and has had meetings with Mr Abbott and senior members of his front bench. The Coalition doesn't believe in genuine partnership between government and the sector to build a more inclusive community. Their approach is for government to vacate the field, cut funding and expect charities, volunteers and the wider community to fend for themselves. In the words of the former Archbishop of Canterbury, Rowan Williams, big society was designed to conceal a deeply damaging withdrawal of the state from its responsibilities to the most vulnerable. And the head of the Catholic Church in England and Wales, Archbishop Vincent Nichols, said that big society was about government washing its hands of its responsibilities and expecting volunteers to fill the gap. And that's what the Coalition want to import to Australia. This shows us why the Coalition would be a disaster for this sector. It would be a disaster for the Australian community, especially for the most disadvantaged. In the UK, the results are in on the failed big society experiment. No one talks about it anymore. There's no speeches about the big society. Charities have been put under strain by new outsourcing processes. Government expenditure has decreased dramatically in some areas of key importance to charities. For example, there's been a 35% reduction in religious and community services. A recent study by the UK Charities Aid Foundation found that nearly 1 in 6 charities believe that they may face closure in the coming year amid public spending cuts and falling donations? Well, we've got a very different approach. We believe in a strong and cooperative relationship between government and the sector to build a more inclusive community. Governments cannot vacate the field and expect that the vacuum will be filled. That is just wishful thinking. That's what happened in the UK. Government needs to work with the sector and with philanthropists and with volunteers to address disadvantage and build social capital. We need to build the foundations of a strong, effective sector, and that's what our reforms have been about. We will deal with the issue of red tape through the bodies that we have established. We'll continue to work with states and territories. We will continue to invest in education, health and community sectors. We are about building. The big society experiment failed in the UK, but the coalition want to try it out in Australia. Their experiment will end up the same as the UK, a disaster. It will do nothing to address disadvantage, only make it worse. It won't lead to a more vibrant, diverse and independent not-for-profit sector, but create uncertainty and fear. There are two alternative visions. Our vision is clear, a cooperative approach. The coalition's position is clear, a failed experiment, and I thank you for the opportunity to draw that to your attention today, and I look forward to taking questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Cameron. And a third very warm welcome, please, for Senator Rachel Siewert.
Thank you and good afternoon. Before I start, I would like to pay my respects to and acknowledge the traditional owners of this land, the Ngunnawal people. This always was and always will be Aboriginal land. I welcome very much the opportunity to be here today, as I recognise how important this debate is to the not-for-profit sector, and particularly because I believe that civil society plays an absolutely critical and essential role, not just in delivering critical services, but in our democracy. The representations that the not-for-profit organisations make, for example, on behalf of the marginalised, the vulnerable members of our community, on the environment, are critical contributions to public policy debate. In fact, you are the leaders of debate. Politicians follow. This has been your year in terms of legislative reform, and I'm very glad to have worked with many of you on strengthening the legislation that passed through the Parliament. Greens in Parliament, listening to your concerns and acting on them, have been able to achieve a lot in that reform process. Most notably, the government made significant legislative and policy changes following the parliamentary inquiries into the ACNC legislation, and with our negotiations in balance of power, have significantly improved the independence of the sector, as well as the anti-gag clauses, which was an initiative of the Greens, and the changes to the Commonwealth Grants guidelines. Promoting a vibrant, diverse and independent sector is now firmly embedded as one of the three objectives of the ACNC, which is in itself an independent body. However, I still see some significant issues for the sector. Even with this recent reform, this is still a sector under pressure that is deeply affected by government policy and decision-making. The sector deals with the results of government policies on a range of social and environmental issues. For example, cutting the payments of single parents on January 1 put immense pressure on a range of social service providers to pick up the pieces. Yet there was no formal monitoring of the impact of the policy as it unfolded, or additional resources available to services offering emergency relief. There is clearly an expectation on the sector to do more and more, but often without adequate funding. The concept of big society, or whatever the coalition renames it here in Australia, has been thrown around. I have very significant concerns about what this means for Australian charities and the sector. Given the UK experience where the responsibility of government has shifted onto charities, but that the financial support to deliver what was previously delivered by government isn't there. Most importantly, social indicators are getting worse. For example, increased rates in homelessness and an increase in household inequality. Then, for those who can access government funding or who enjoy a tax deductibility status, There are still significant compliance burdens to deal with. Harmonising legislation across state and federal governments is clearly still a long way off. This is just a brief snapshot of the pressures that the Greens see and want to address. But above all else, the Greens remain concerned with ensuring that there is an independent and diverse sector. When I first came to Parliament in 2005, it was during the Howard era. Before that, I had in fact run a peak NGO organisation for 16 years. I saw firsthand how government used control of the Senate to try and weaken the not-for-profit sector and fought to resist that. I note that according to the Pro Bono survey, Queenslanders are very gloomy in their outlook compared to the rest of the country. I wonder if this is because of their antithetical approach to civil society in that state. Given our strong belief in and support for civil society and the not-for-profit sector, I have to say that I was disturbed by some of what I heard during the debate on the Charities Definition Bill earlier this year. And if you want a bit of an enlightenment there, go and read some of the Hansard. It's very disappointing reading. There were some particularly unwarranted attacks on environmental NGOs, and I hope this isn't a sign of things to come. It is absolutely critical that the checks and balances like the ACNC that have been put in place to prevent the government from undermining NGOs are not unwound in the next term of government. The sector plays a vital role in the sector's role, which is vital in advocacy, must not be threatened and must be valued. As well as protecting the independence of the sector, the Greens will continue to focus on finding ways to reduce the compliance and red tape burden on the sector. I recognise that the cost of compliance poses huge imposts on organisations. I believe that great improvements are still to be gained through, for example, new technology, which can assist in harmonising government reporting systems, but this will require a whole-of-government commitment to delivering a charities passport and other improvements for those not-for-profits who do receive government grants, and I know how hard that is proving to be to deliver on that. I also recognise that there are a range of tax and trust transparency reforms that are still under consideration, that haven't been fully dealt with and need in the previous term of government and still need to be. However, I am concerned that if the emphasis is on creating the environment for giving, but not on government raising revenue to fund services, there is still going to be a gap in many ways in the landscape that not-for-profits are working in. There is also a huge risk that donations and therefore services will decline at the point when they are most needed, as happened in 2009 with following the global financial crisis impacts. There is clearly a role for not-for-profits in delivery of services, and it's clear that that not-for-profits deliver them more effectively and particularly in a more caring manner. But this doesn't mean that government vacates that space. They still have a responsibility to provide that fundamental safety net. I also believe that an emphasis on efficiency and competitive tendering has caused a reduction in the diversity of the sector in some cases, for example, job services, and that we need to make sure that we retain specialist services and that government is better equipped to measure and consider the success of these specialist services within a tendering framework. The Greens stand for a caring, compassionate Australia and recognise that a strong relationship between government and an independent, diverse, not-for-profit sector is vital to delivering that. We will continue, as we have been doing strongly to date, to work on strengthening the sector and maintaining that vital independence. Thank you.
Well, thank you all for those opening remarks. We're going to have a usual period of questions and answers now, but if I might take the Chair's prerogative and kick off. One of the issues that all three of you has raised is around sort of red tape and the compliance burdens for the sector. One person I was talking to earlier was noting that in terms of sort of duplicate paperwork requirements, if you want to fundraise in Australia for charitable purposes, you need to register in every different jurisdiction across the country. In policy terms from each of your parties, what action would you be looking to take in the next term of Parliament on that front to see if some headway could be made through harmonising or standardising that process?
Yep. Well, we've already had discussions with the states under the COAG framework to say that we must get rid of unnecessary red tape. We must make sure that charities and not-for-profit organisations can operate seamlessly right throughout the whole of the economy and across states. That's the debate and the argument for every other sector of society. Why should it be any different? So we see that that's the first thing that should be done, and we will also have the Charities Commission working collaboratively in cooperation with the sector to identify the issues of red tape and get rid of red tape wherever it possibly can. I mean, red tape is used as some derogatory term at times, but we must make sure that if you are a charity, that you're accountable, and that if you are a charity, then the money that's being collected is actually being distributed for charitable purposes. That's what everyone here does, but you know that there are some issues in the past where that's been a problem, and we have to make sure that there are proper checks and balances. So you just can't have a completely deregulated sector.
I think that's one of the key roles that ACNC need to be carrying out, and there has been some criticism that they're focused more on the regulatory approach than on getting rid of red tape. One of the things that we negotiated as part of the legislation was that the ACNC had to be reporting once a year, or reporting to Parliament, on red tape reduction. If you look at the number of reports that you have to do across the various agencies, each grant has to be reported. We need to make sure that when reports are being developed, they can be used multiple times. Report once, use often. We are yet, when the wage case, when the government committed the resources to the pay equity case, each agency got a letter from each government department. Fair enough, each of those letters dealt with, if you had a DOHA grant, Health and Ageing, you had a number of grants. One letter dealt with those grants, but you also got a letter from FAXIA, from DEWA. That is ridiculous. So those are the sorts of things that actually need to be dealt with if we are going to cut red tape.
Frankly, there is a vast chasm between the rhetoric and the practical outcomes. I mean, everybody talks about cutting red tape, but what have we seen? More red tape. The ACNC is another level of regulatory burden that hasn't replaced any regulatory burden elsewhere at this stage. We've got another 100 people employed in a new bureaucracy. What we need is actual practical things that are going to reduce red tape, the sorts of things which I announced in my speech today. Everybody can talk. Everybody, well, Senator, I heard a lot of rhetoric from you. I didn't hear one positive, practical thing that you're proposing to do in the future if re-elected. Whereas I've set forward today and in more detail elsewhere, practical things that we would do to actually reduce red tape. And we can be held accountable by those things because we've set them out in great detail as to how we will do it. And that comes after widespread discussion with not only many people in this room, but many people in charitable and community and not-for-profit organisations right across Australia. It's their agenda which we're reflecting in this program of how we can actually reduce government involvement in an unnecessary way in the sector.
But most of the people responding to the pro bono survey said they want to keep the ACNC.
Well, that's not the feedback I'm getting. For example, I got a letter just in the last few days from one of the biggest charities in Australia involved in the provision of services, which says, if I can quote, "We've been concerned that the original premise underlying the Commission objective of reducing red tape and duplication, light touch regulation and principles-based governance standards commensurate with individual charity size and circumstances was unlikely to be achieved." This is coming from one of the major players in the sector saying whatever the aspirations were for the ACNC in the first place, what we've actually got is the opposite of what was set out. Now, we believe that we can bring about Harmonisation, to come back to your original question, Misha, in terms of fundraising codes and the like, cut out a lot of red tape. But that'll only occur if we've got somebody who's prepared to drive this and make sure that not only it happens in terms of the relationship with the sector, but it also happens in terms of the bureaucracy itself.
So who does the regulation? The tax office?
One at a time.
Yeah.
Who's now going to do that regulatory process? Is it going to be the tax office? Because every bit of feedback I've had from the sector is that they do not want the ATO running the regulatory process for the not-for-profit sector.
And what the Shadow Treasurer Joe Hockey has said is we are looking carefully at the tax office with one of the proposals on the table to actually split the functions of the tax office, that the policing function, that regulatory function of the tax office would be separate from the other functions of the tax office.
That is bureaucracy.
And that is consistent with what I am saying. Well, you give us a practical proposal of what you're going to do, Doug.
The practical proposal's there. The practical proposal is the ACNC dealing in consultation with the sector to reduce red tape. That is clearly a proposition. I think the sector should have some certainty. I think they should be able to rely on some certainty into the future. These are big organisations. I don't know who's written to you saying this is terrible, but the ACNC is brand spanking new. It's only just been set up, and we will work to make sure it works effectively. Now, let me say that I've seen the same survey, and the survey says it's overwhelmingly supported. How many here want to get rid of the ACNC? Stick your hand up if you do, so we can get an idea whether this is a big problem. Who wants rid of it? There's the answer, and that's consistent.
Doug, you're not going to get people, and it's totally unfair of you to ask people in an audience like this.
Well, who likes it? Who thinks it's going all right?
Well,
it's going all right.
Well, then equally one person.
No, you're wrong. There was quite a number of hands went up.
Look, the question here is, though, as I said, there is a lot of rhetoric about reducing red tape, about putting the sector in a position where where the political community can be of service to the community and civil sector in Australia. We will do that by allowing the sector to get on and do the job. You know, a child welfare worker in Victoria told me a few weeks ago, a child welfare worker told me that they spend up to 50% of their time just filling in paperwork rather than actually out there doing the work at the front line. Now, I think that is absolutely ridiculous. That's what's happening under your system at the present time, and that's what we will fix.
Is that the New South Wales government as well?
No, it wasn't New South Wales.
We might move to another question, perhaps from Ken Randall.
Thanks, Misha. Ken Randall from Icentia, who used to be better known as Media Monitors. Obviously, this system of regulatory control from the top is the biggest dividing point between the Coalition and the Greens and Labor. But you all seem to be getting different information. I mean, how do you all talk about what a diverse sector this is, and it certainly is, but who do you talk to form the opinions upon which you base these policies that you put forward today?
I'm happy to answer that, Ken. I've spent the last 2 years, probably longer, travelling the country, talking to hundreds of community groups, charitable organisations, right across the length and breadth of Australia. From the big organisations, many of whom are represented in this room today, down to the very small community organisation. Remember, this is a sector of which there are some 600,000 organisations. Some of these are just small community groups where a band of people in a local town or city or locality have come together because they have perceived a need within their own area which they believe needs to be addressed, and they've come together to do that. That's that vital, organic life that's in the community of this nation, and that's what we have to give expression to. We shouldn't be standing in the way of that. We should be giving them every encouragement to go out and do that, and they're the people that I've been listening to.
Well, we've been listening to the sector as well, and I think this is probably the most authoritative position that we could deal with, where there's been a professional, analytical approach done to find out what people think are the important issues for the sector. and the ACNC is supported by 70% of the sector. It gives some certainty to the sector about how we move forward, and the nonsense of disbanding something that is international best practice is operated around the world by major economies is just nonsense. I just don't understand why, by going out to somebody in the back block somewhere and saying, well, they don't like it, so we'll get rid of it, why we would stop listening to the peak body of the sector and listen to the major players in the sector. It's clear the ACNC has the capacity to drive this sector forward, and I think it places the sector in good standing for the future, and the public want that regulation, not overbearing regulation, but regulation that they can be confident that if they're giving money to a charity, that charity is overseen by a reputable body, and the ACNC is a reputable body.
This no longer reflects international best practice. New Zealand has moved away from this model. Other countries around the world have moved away from this model. Go and talk, as I've done, Doug, I know you haven't been in the job very long, go and talk, as I've done, to charities in the UK, and they will tell you what a financial and legal and regulatory burden is on them, so much so that they are devoting more resources now to more form filling, to more bureaucracy, to more red tape, rather than actually doing what they're there to do, and that is to serve the communities. That's the reality. So, you know, you're frankly talking nonsense.
Well, if the big problem for the sector is form filling, then I just think that belies the real issues the sector are trying to deal with. The real issues the sector are trying to deal with is poverty. It's the lack of capacity to actually deal with some of the major challenges for young people in poverty, for older people that can't get a home. These are huge issues: homelessness, housing, massive problems in that area. And this sector is in there doing that. I have not heard one person come to me and say that, you know, and I think I've spoken to 40 not-for-profit organisations in the last 8 weeks, and I've not heard one of them saying that filling forms out is crippling them. They say, yeah, we'd like to fill out less forms, but when they talk to me, they talk to me about helping kids, they talk to me about helping old people, they talk to me about getting people off the streets, they talk to me about getting kids into education. They're the issues they talk to me about, and if they're talking to you about form filling, no wonder you can't get it.
No, Doug.
Maybe I could answer the question, have an opportunity to answer the question as well. I too have been, for a long time, not just the last couple of years, but having come from the NGO sector, I've got fairly good contacts there for a start, but also have spent a long time working and know the issues that they face. I've spent a long time in this portfolio speaking to a wide range of organisations, not just in the community services area, but also in the environment area as well, across the country, big and small, peak and individuals, and they have all been supportive of a charity type commission in the first place. That was what they were lobbying for. Not everyone now is satisfied with the performance of the ACNC, and anybody that follows what I said in Parliament when we were debating the regulations over the governance standards will know that there has been some concern raised. But we, the Greens, are confident that they will get on and do the job properly, and that the majority of the sector has their support. Right. I acknowledge some people in the sector don't support it. They never did support it. But if you look at the submissions that we got to the Senate inquiry, I participated in all the Senate inquiries, numerous ones into the charity sector, and particularly into ACNC, and there was majority support for the establishment of an ACNC. So that's where we took our guide from, was that the voices that said, over the majority of voices that said we should support an ACNC, but we went to great lengths to try and get amendments that better reflected what the community was saying about what they wanted in an ACNC. And we negotiated, one of those, as an example, was the anti-gag legislation, gag clause, so that you couldn't put for those that don't know what anti-gag clause is in, it means that if you get, simple version is if you get funding from the government, they can't turn around and say you can't speak about something, which is what was happening under the Howard government. That can no longer happen because that legislation is in place. When we were negotiating the definition, the charities definition, we also made sure that advocacy was in there so that organisations could be advocates, because that's one of the big issues that organisations talk to me about, is their capacity to also be advocates. It's not just the role of organisations to be service deliverers, they are also advocates for the people that they support.
And I should say for the record, Misha, that when the separate anti-gag clause legislation came before the Parliament, the Coalition supported it.
So you should
our
have.
Our position is, and well, I'm prompted to say a bit more now. Our position and my position is this: that consistent with what I believe about the role of civil society, I believe that the community in which we live functions better when people like yourselves, representing community and charitable organisations right across this country, can have your say about what's important. And if that happens, in my view, to be contrary or offend the government of the day, then so be it, because I think we have a better society as a result.
Well, I agree with that. And let me say this. Well, I hope, Kevin, that you go to Queensland and you go to New South Wales and you tell your coalition colleagues that that is the voice from Canberra for the coalition on that policy issue, because they have reintroduced gag policy and gag frameworks in those states, and I just think it's really bad. So let's hope the coalition can get the message through right across the country.
It's also, with due respect, some of the statements that your backbencher colleagues made when they were debating the Charities Definition Bill sends shivers up my spine in terms of them questioning the right of environment groups. They're questioning their right for advocacy, and I would, as I said, I would suggest people go and read it, because if that is if your approach is what the coalition's now saying, you're saying that's what the position of the coalition is, I think you need to remind some of the backbenchers, because some of those backbenchers do not support the right of advocacy. It's very clear from the comments that they made in the chamber.
Well, what I've said represents coalition policy.
Okay. Our next question comes from Laurie Wilson.
Laurie Wilson, freelance journalist and president of the National Press Club. Just at the outset, this is not my question, I just want to make the point that I am on the board of a public charitable trust, and we do have just a few concerns about the ACNC, although we acknowledge that it's early days yet, so a wait and see attitude, to be frank, from my perspective anyway. I didn't put my hand up to either of the questions before. My question goes to a comment by Senator Rachel Siewert, where she said increasingly the sector is under pressure to do more and more without adequate resources. Now, if I can go, first of all, to the opposition and put to you that, Mr Andrews, that you said in your comments that you don't want to do less for the sector, but you want to help people do more. And that could well be read for code that the very comment that Senator Siewert has made is going to continue. That you're not going to do less, but you're not going to do more either. That it could, in fact, that problem could continue. So I'd like you to comment on that. Mr Cameron, Senator Siewert's comments basically relate to when Labor's been on watch. This is happening under you. So, I mean, how do you respond to that? And how do you respond to viewers who might say, well, you know, you've said cut, 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 that's what the Liberals are going to do. There's no real evidence for that. I mean, you might interpret it that way, but there's no hard evidence for that. How do you respond to people who might say, well, it's just really a scare campaign from your side of politics?
Laurie, thanks for the question.
And Senator Siewert, you might get a comment on the comments of the gentleman on either side of you.
Laurie, look at what we did in government. We increased funding to community agencies, to family service agencies, to all of those things, all of those organisations in government. So when I say that we don't want government to do less, what I'm saying is take the example of the community business partnerships. One of the things that came out of that was the private ancillary funds. This enabled people to actually devote more of their private money and direct it to community and charitable activities. Something like $200 million a year now by individuals is directed irrevocably into community and charitable activities. Now, that's fallen partly into disuse, or it hasn't been expanded the way in which we believe it can. We think that if we can encourage the community not just to see government as the only source of funding, not to reduce government funding, but to encourage a more philanthropic attitude within the community, then we can actually do more. It's not about doing less on the part of government. We did more in government, and we'll continue to do more in government. But we should be trying to encourage the community, not just for the value of the money which is provided, but because this is how we do build social fabric in our communities. When people have a stake in what's happening in the community in which they live, and whether that's through giving of their finances or giving of their time and effort, that's important to building vibrant communities.
I don't think there would be too many sitting around this forum who would argue that Labour in government has not worked hard with the sector to try and improve not only relationships, communications, but actually help the sector do what it's set up to do. We haven't heard much about that. Looking after poor people, looking after people that can't look after themselves, that's what Labour is about. And we just see the people sitting around here as the people who go out and deliver that on the ground. So we've taken a view, we have to work with them. We are never going to solve all the problems overnight. But I just think that what we've set about doing, having a decent definition, a modern definition for charity, set up the regulator who can act, not just regulate, but reduce red tape, help charities, look at how we can go down the track, get capital formation for charities, because that's something that hasn't been mentioned here today. This is the big issue that comes back to me. What can government do to help with capital formation so that you can go out and muscle up on the finances you have with the support of government to do more charitable work out in the community? These are the big issues, I think, and everything else that we hear about red tape and about, copying what's happening in the UK, that is a nonsense. It's about having an Australian approach to a problem that is a worldwide problem, and we should be setting international standards.
I'd like to go back to the point that I made in my speech, and that is government policy impacts on the not-for-profit sector of civil society. And I use the example of single parents. When single parents were dumped onto Newstart in January, the only place that they could get help from was from community services. And we've seen a spike in the call on emergency relief organisations. We saw the ACOS survey released not that long ago that showed that services have had to reduce the breadth of the services they can offer because there's too much pressure on them to deliver. So what both the ALP and the Coalition have ignored just then was their policy decisions, regardless of the funding that they provide, their policy decisions impact on the work that services do, and that has not been acknowledged and needs to be. There was not even any monitoring of the impact on community services. When those single parents were dumped on Newstart, there was no monitoring of the impact of that on emergency services that caused. That has to change if we are really, really, truly going to be saying that we are supportive of community service organisations. And it's all very well, and I'm not saying there's anything wrong with encouraging private giving, absolutely, and from business. But you cannot allow that to replace government responsibility, absolutely. And you cannot allow that, that giving to direct how you supply those services. Because what I'm concerned about is when big business donate, they then determine where those services can be directed. And you've seen, for example, Twiggy Forrest, when Andrew Forrest, with the way he's directing services for Aboriginal employment. Now what the Coalition's talking about is going down those lines, because that's what Andrew Forrest says where we should be directing our employment services and supporting Aboriginal employment. We haven't had proper evaluation of those services. So if we're going to encourage private big philanthropy, I can never say that word, by the way, big business donating, we also need to make sure that the level of independence that we require from government is also applied there as well.
Rachel, we shouldn't be unfair to big business. Let me take an example. Here we are at the National Australia Bank National Press Club luncheon. The National Australia Bank through its support for the financial literacy and financial services program through the Good Shepherd organisation, is providing wonderful service to communities and the most vulnerable people right across this country. That's done by a commercial organisation in Australia, and it's done, and I've never heard a complaint about that service. They brought together a few hundred of people from all over Australia in Melbourne about a month ago. So organisations like the one sponsoring this event are already contributing to the community,
and I'm not having a go at that.
And we should be encouraging more of that support from the community. But can I tell you, they do it without all the red tape that government requires of agencies like yours. And secondly, can I just take the opportunity to disabuse Senator Cameron of the notion that we are following the so-called big society program of the UK. I've been thinking about these things long before I'd ever heard of the big society. Senator, not everything that comes out of the UK we follow in Australia.
Can I just say, I wasn't having a go. I was pointing out that we need to be very careful about the processes we put in place so that we're not skewing the way that support is given to the sector.
Look, we think, from our perspective, this is not about, should big business be involved, should government be involved, should, small groups be allowed to go off and do their own thing. Our view is quite clear that there is a collective responsibility for government, business and the community to look after the most vulnerable people in our community. And that's what you guys do day in, day out. And there has to be a role for government. And to simply splash this issue of red tape across, as some real problem for government, I think just ignores the good work that's done, both from government, private business and your sector. We have to work together. That's the main thing. And government should not walk away from their responsibility for looking after people that can't look after themselves. And that means we have to work closely and well with your sector.
Our next question comes from Peter Phillips.
Thank you, Misha. I want to, with your indulgence, broaden the base a bit, cast a somewhat wider net, based upon a premise that the philanthropic tradition or philanthropic instinct in Australia is not as well established in broad terms as it is in some of the major Northern Hemisphere democracies. In the United States, for specific example, or for particular example. And on that basis, the brilliance and the dedication of the work of the not-for-profit sector notwithstanding, I ask for all three of the panel members to offer their thoughts on what in government can be done, what in government should be done, and what in government will be done to enhance or to develop further the instinct in Australia for a more generous and engaging and engaged attitude towards philanthropy and the philanthropic sector.
And I might have to ask everyone to keep their remarks reasonably tight on this, so we do give everyone a chance for a 1-minute summation as well. So, Senator Siewert, do you want to jump in first on this?
I think one of the areas that certainly I was involved in wearing my old hat when I worked in the sector was payroll giving, and using payroll donations I think is a very useful, allowing people to donate through their payroll, for the payroll system, I think isn't used enough in Australia, and that we need to be promoting that more. I also think that the role of the ACNC about an independent and diverse sector also, it's part of their role is to, I think, should be also to promote the work and work with the sector to promote that work. But there's lots of other things that we should be doing, I think, to highlight the work of the sector. But I'll focus my answers just on those two for the time being.
Mr Andrews?
Can I gently take issue that we are not a nation of givers? If you go back to even the 1860s, when mutual societies were established and building societies and things like that, we have a long history in Australia of giving. Now that changes in the nature of it over the years, but if you have a major natural disaster in Australia like the bushfires we had in Victoria, then people gave inordinate amounts of money, and it's a wonderful reflection, I think, of that broad sense of community within Australia. So We do have, I think, a long history of that, but what we need to make sure is we continue to encourage it. That's why something like the Community Business Partnership is important, because that's a practical solution that can help people in new circumstances to actually make those contributions, which I think with a little encouragement, most Australians want to be able to do.
And Senator Cameron.
I think the scale of the problems facing some of our most vulnerable Australians cannot be solved through philanthropy. Philanthropy is important. I encourage it. I welcome it, and it's great to see business and high wealth individuals doing philanthropic things. And I don't have an argument with that. But the history of basically the world in terms of philanthropy is one where that on its own cannot solve the problems. And if you go back and you look at philanthropy and charitable work, that didn't solve the problems. And this is the big difference I would have with the coalition. It was only when government started to intervene on behalf of poorer people that we actually made progress. We haven't made enough progress, because I'd like to have a position where probably your sector doesn't need to exist. That means that there's people out there getting a good life and well looked after. But that's not the reality. So relying on philanthropy, relying on charity is not what we should be doing on its own. It's a practical issue that we've got at the moment, but government has a role and it needs to take a strong role in a whole range of areas. So I go back to what I've been saying most of the day. It's about a combination of government, business and your sector coming together to work hard to make life better for the most vulnerable in society.
We're almost out of time. There's been a number of issues raised in quite a spirited and good debate today. So I wonder if I could invite you in reverse order then to give some closing remarks. And Senator Siewert, would you like to begin?
Thank you. I believe, and the Greens believe, in a vibrant, strong, diverse civil society, and believe it's absolutely essential to our community and to our democracy. That you are the leaders and that government and political parties follow. We are committed to ensuring the strength and vitality of civil society. I believe we have a track record in ensuring that and pursuing that, and that we will continue that track record. I'm deeply concerned if we see ACNC, after it's only been in place for a very short time, if we see that disappear, because I, for one, do not want to see a situation where this sector is regulated by the ATO.
Thank you, Senator Siewert. Senator Cameron.
Yeah, look, I go back to Kevin Andrews' first proposition that he put to this forum. He said it was about vision. Well, I didn't see much vision other than this paranoid issue about red tape. I've got to say that the position that we've adopted, and that is in cooperation and in consultation with the sector, is to have a strong sector, to have a sector that's got some certainty, that has an organisation that is your regulator, that you can influence into the future, that you can work with government to make things better. But fundamentally, what we've got to do is focus on the real issues like capital formation, look at how we can get more money back to where it's needed, and that is to the poorest people in our society. That needs government, it needs business, and it needs you guys working with both those areas to make things better.
Thank you, Senator Cameron. And from Mr Andrews.
The only party speaking here today with some practical plans for the future are those which I've outlined. They involve an involvement of both government and the sectors of civil society working together. But importantly, they include government getting out of your way so that you can get on with the vital job which you do for communities right round Australia. If we're elected on September 7, that's what we will do. We will get out of your way in terms of regulation so that all of those vital services in terms of housing, in terms of family services, in terms of all the myriad of things which you do, you can do better, and we will support you to do it.
And that brings us to the end of our formal proceedings today. So thank you all for your participation, and thank you to the audience for being involved as well. Thank you. We never like to let our guests go away empty-handed here at the National Press Club, so we're going to leave you all with a little token of our affection and a membership card so that you can come back whenever you choose. Thank you so much.
Good on you.
Thank you.